Dallas, Texas, and Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Lee was nested in, 2 rows behind the wing. The westering sun was in her eyes, dipping above and below the wing, stabbing her in the face, really. And the woman in the center seat nudged her with her elbow and made little nods at the TV screen in the aisle, and then at the bright beam of light flashing into the cabin. But Lee just leaned her head on the cold plastic pane and stared past the scratches into the wavering exhaust of the jet. The heat poured out like the smoke of burnt offerings, and she was burnt too, throwing herself on the mercy of the notoriously merciless gods. But if she was an offering, which one was she? The pile of bones and skin, worthless carcass with creamy white fat on top, all pitch and no product, or the really good stuff in the ratty package? Her eyes itched behind her swollen, hot face. She wasn't even crying anymore, but it felt distended with unassimilable grief. Each time her mind circled around to her humiliation, it grew stronger, and the face grew hotter, and the corners of her mouth turned down and down. Her mind circled around and landed again at his relentless voice. Nobody is a virgin at 27 unless... And anybody who buys a story like that, and you were happy enough, and stupid bitch. I mean, I'm sorry, but really, take a look. Is it stupidity? Nobody believes they are stupid. Not really. We all say we're weak at math, or no good with computers, or can't follow a recipe, but not stupid. Nobody really thinks they themselves are actually stupid. Maybe there's something kinder to think, something she could live with. She looked through the receding gaps in the clouds below the wing, back and down till she saw years of early nights, years of hearing him slip quietly out for his walk while the TV nattered on, and all that it said as she fell asleep was fool and fool and fool. The suitcase had come through. Lee unbuckled it. Inside was the costume. Soft drums started up in the hills, and she strained to catch them as she put it on in her rented cottage room. The costume was garish in the afternoon light, a slinky mini dress, all silver scales, and the green tights like a mermaid, though now she worried if her legs would look too froggy, mannish and wiry, not soft enough, not fluid and voluptuous like the drawing on the package. It looked fake and slutty, something Gary would have sneered at. The sense of him sneering was the only thing that made her keep it on. Lee turned her head upside down, shaking her soft brown curls till they fluffed back up, tousled crown. Last of all, the earrings, long and flashing. She felt so exposed. There was a bit of flirt to the tiny skirt, but there was no mistaking the bareness of the body inside it. Still, this was what she came for, to be lost in the crowds at Carnival and take no pictures, to be inside the riot and the bacchanal. She would strip like a wild girl and mate with a stag. She was 27 now, ripe as she'd ever be. Her marriage was a lie, Gary was a lie, the farmer's market idyll was over and done, and there was no amount of drinking in the same bar with the same friends that would take her out of herself. She needed to feel this crowd. She'd come for the crowd. What she felt was the drums. Last of all, she snapped the little bracelet to her ankle. When Tina had told her about pickup service, she'd said, "That's sick." The whole idea of being so lost, intentionally so lost that you needed an RFID chip to call for someone to pick you up afterwards. It was like a luggage tag. She'd never imagined casting herself so completely over the edge. But then Tina planted the image, and in the horror of discovering she was a fool, Lee also discovered a hunger to be entirely foolish. She'd been drunk before, but this was special. The service would bring her back to the cottage. Tina's brother Benjamin would come back for her tomorrow night and trundle her onto the plane. Her brain kept popping up and asking her, why? It's not like any amount of debauchery would change the way she'd spent 10 years loyal to Gary, careful and trusting, and entirely believing his cancer story. His fucking cancer story. But it didn't matter what her brain said. Her brain had lost all credibility. She took all the separate baggies the costume pieces had been packed in and nested them, burping and sealing each layer with silver-painted nails before cocooning it in the next. In the heat of her little room, the fresh plastic smell was comforting, the taste of civilization, sweet among the bitter stinks of the hillside. Moving through the crowds on her way to the cottage, she'd been smelling sweat, hair, that weird dirty smell like oil, but not like the street people back home. It was a brighter smell, strong and bitter, but freshly brewed. Here was mostly the distinct rankness of the pit latrines behind the row of cottages, if you could call them cottages, more like sheds. No window faced to the hillside privies. Gary's snide voice echoed in her head. But this window looked across the track to another little house, and in the yard stood a girl. She was obviously still a girl, maybe 16, high-breasted and deep brown-black skin and wide, joyful eyes, being painted for carnival. Lee slowed completely to stare at her. She was naked on the hillside, a few steps from the house, and her friend, aunt, big sister, had a wide steel bowl of liquid gold. They jumped and laughed, waving their hands at the off-gassing of the metallic ink. The sister started at her neck and poured the gold onto the younger one slowly, smoothing it into her skin with swift, flat strokes. Their laughter was turning to wild whoops of joy, till they both cleaned their hands of the gold by rubbing them in her hair and rubbed the bowl around her head, too. Her thick black curls, tight and fierce, were glued together with sunlight now. The fluff of her pubic hair was a dark mystery at the center of her shining body. The girl looked towards the window and saw Lee watching, and laughed, waggled her nude golden bottom at her. Lee stared down at her own tiny nipples, barely visible in the dress. There was a moment early that night when Lee remembered that she had wanted to see Rio, to see the streets and the buildings, to get a sense of it as a place, and she felt regret. It was the last thing she remembered thinking. After that, all she could remember were disconnected sights and sounds, feelings. There was the spinning vortex, some dance in which many feathered men were grabbing people, women, right out of the crowd, and dancing with them. But it was not so much dancing, it was more they just spun you endlessly clockwise, passing you from one to the next, keeping the rhythm and torque going.